We're here to idea everyone, to fire up your curiosity and connect you with the people and ideas that shape our world. Watch, listen, understand, connect, create. Let's move the human story forward together. Welcome to ideaXme. I'm Neil Koenig. Think of the country Iran today, and modern art might not be the first thing that comes to mind. One collector who's tried to change that perception is Mohammed Afkhami, who's built up a large collection of Iranian art in recent years. You can see some works from his collection in the show Rebel, Jester, Mystic, Poet, on display at the Asia Society in New York until May 2022. Mohammed, thanks for joining us. Before we talk about the exhibition, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks for giving me a few minutes to talk about the collection and what I'm trying to achieve. I'm of Iranian origin, but I consider myself an anglicized Iranian because I left Iran during the revolution at the age of 4 in 1979, and pretty much spent my formative years in the UK and Switzerland. So I consider the UK as my sort of adopted home, with London being the base. And then I went to study in the States. And then I worked in a series of financial services firms until I set up my own, gradually starting in New York or Chicago, then New York, then London. And for the last 20 years, have been based in Dubai. And it's actually been a great journey because I sort of think that my life has done a full loop in that I started in the Middle East and I sort of ended up back in the Middle East. And Dubai is sort of the perfect accommodation because I still feel a strong sense of Iranian identity, but given what I do for a living and where I sit, unfortunately, the opportunities that are, let's say, present for me are not in Iran. They sort of exist in the Middle East and London and New York, but yet Dubai gives me that sort of sense of being close to home because there's such a strong Iranian influence, and a lot of Iranian expatriates are there, and so I've had Dubai as sort of my second home now for the past 20 years. And in that time, since the early days of when I moved there in 2004, I started reconnecting with Iran, but more on a cultural basis by beginning to collect art from that country. And so that's a 16, 17-year project, and it continues, but it wasn't a project that was sort of designated by accident. I think coming from a family like my own that were, let's say, very involved in art collecting and sort of art philanthropy from the 60s, where my grandfather had a very large collection of Islamic art and antiquities that my mother also helped him amass. I've always been surrounded by art from Iran, albeit from a different period. And I've also had the privilege of knowing some of the great academics that covered Iranian and Islamic art history growing up. And it was an accidental passion that it sort of stumbled on me when I was visiting family in Iran in 2004. And I had to spend a little longer there than I'd hoped because I had to renew some paperwork. And I was introduced to a few contemporary galleries. At the time, there were less than a handful. And I saw some beautiful artworks. And of course, I wasn't familiar with like the Iranian currency. Unfortunately, Iranian currency has a lot of zeros. And I asked the gallerist, I said, this was a Mah gallery in central Tehran. How much is this work? She's like, 50,000. I'm like, I'm going to have to work a lot harder to buy that work. There's no 50,000 riyals. And at the time, it equated to something like $500. And so I bought my first two artworks.
What were these artworks?
These were actually by two great modern masters of Iranian art, very recognized, published, museum exhibited. One is a gentleman called Sirak Milkonian, who is an Iranian Armenian, and the other one was a guy called Masoud Arabshahi. Both, as I said, very talented, recognized modern masters. And one work was very sort of minimalist. It almost looks sort of Japanese-esque. It's very clean, almost refined looking art. And the other one was by Masoud, and that was more, it almost had a feeling of like an engineering schematic, but with abstraction overlaid over it. And again, both works were beautiful. And I thought I was very lucky to buy them for $500 each. And of course, when I bought these works, I started buying more because it was so affordable. And I just bought my first home in Dubai, and I created a lot of wall space. So I said, I gotta buy art to populate this home. And then, of course, this sort of passion stepped in, and I was telling my mother about it, and she was not convinced. I mean, she knew many of these modern artists, but she was more an advocate of more traditional Islamic art and antiquities. But then, as I showed her some of the works, her knowledge and her connections within Iran and with the actual artists proved invaluable, because she caught the bug, and we really built this collection together. And today, the collection has just over 600 works. About 480 to 500 are from Iranian artists, but not just Iranian artists from the modern and contemporary period in Iran, but also in the diaspora. So we collect artists that are of Iranian origin, but might have never even been to Iran. And about 100 of the 600 works are really contemporary and modern artists from around the world, because there's also an aesthetic override on the collection where, of course, we love to support Iranian artists, but on occasion you see a work that's just fabulous, and just because it's not Iranian doesn't mean it should be disqualified. So we have, again, a host of these works that are not from Iran, but keep the same strain of aesthetic appeal, if you like, in the overall collection.
Just go back to your upbringing, your childhood. Your grandfather had a large collection of Iranian art and artworks. What kind of impression do you remember that having on you when you were growing up?
Well, it's funny you asked that question, because as I told you, I left Iran when I was 4, but some of the first memories I have that are quite vivid and quite, clear are that we used to visit my grandfather's house multiple times a week. And it was really quite a treasure trove, because yes, he collected Islamic art and antiquities, but his house was like this fascinating and enchanting sort of house of treasures. It had all kinds of art, and even had Western artworks, all sorts of things, Japanese lacquers. I mean, I remember just if you walked around and touched something, you might cause damage. But it was a very vivid memory, because he really loved his art and lived with it, and was incredibly knowledgeable. And then, of course, when the revolution happened, unfortunately, this collection was largely nationalized. But when we grew up in London, we had kept very close contacts with some of the scholars that had helped archive my grandfather's collection. So these scholars were regularly in our house, and my mother would have these small dinners, always sort of cooking homemade Persian meals that they would all come in for, and we would talk about the art. And my mother decided to formalize her training in the early 80s, and went back and pursued an MPhil at SOAS, the School of Oriental African Studies at the University of London, focusing on a specific period of Qajar art, which is sort of late 1700s, early 1800s. And so there were always some objects in the house, and the house had this sort of, continuous Iranian identity through these artworks that she'd collected as a result of new collecting after the revolution.
Iran has a very long history. What impact does that have on artists working today?
When people talk about Iran, I don't like to think about Iran and Iranian art as any sort of defined boundary. Iran is an idea. And it's very interesting you ask that question, because when you see the way contemporary artists make Iranian or make art, it's amazing to me how they keep drawing from influences in their Iranian identity. Either they're depicting imagery that might be somewhat calligraphic in nature, or it might be depicting a scene that they're imagining from the Shahnameh, which is, our Book of Kings, which is this sort of the equivalent of Homer's Iliad for Iranians, or they're drawing on, the Achaemenid, glory days, when the Persian Empire was at its maximum in terms of size and global influence. It's just interesting how these themes just keep coming back again and again. Even some artists that choose to pick up very strong Shia motifs. I mean, the influences are everywhere. And then, of course, very interestingly, they take this influence and then they adapt it in terms of their technique, and to make it appealing to an audience that would like it today. Because if you think about my parents' generation, they were happy to buy manuscripts and calligraphies. If you talk to people my age and younger, they want big paintings with more abstract features, but yet they're happy to see elements of calligraphy incorporated, but not in the same detailed, almost academic way you see in a traditional Islamic manuscript. And so, but yet the artist does not dump that sort of notion of the past. They're still incorporating it, but they're adapting to their audience. There's this constant dance between the past and what these artists are making today.
Now, you left Iran around the time of the revolution at the end of the 1970s, and then you returned, and that's when you began your journey of exploration of art in Iran. What was the scene like when you went back?
That's a great question. I didn't set foot in Iran from late 78 until 2002. At the time, I was recently appointed the head of a regional arm of a South African bank called Standard Bank. And my region was obviously the Middle East and North Africa. And we had a small satellite office in Tehran that came under my remit. And I went to fly there to check on it. And it was the first time I'd been back in 24 years. And I'm not a very nervous individual, and I don't get sort of, clammy hands when a situation gets, a little tense. But I remember I was flying on Emirates, and they were flying at an interesting altitude. It was like low enough that I could see the tops of the Zagros Mountains as we were flying north through the Gulf, Tehran. And I was getting nervous. And, when I got off the plane, it was very interesting. It's almost like I knew that I came from this land. Like, as soon as I got off the plane and I smelled the air, and there was a gentleman who greeted me at the bottom of the plane, it was as if I'd come back home. It was very interesting. And I can't explain it. I know it sounds preposterous, but it is a very eerie feeling when you know you come from somewhere and you didn't realize it until you did. And it was like that. And it was actually somewhat endearing, despite the fact that the country, is not in the best of states. There was I felt a certain warmth. I felt good about being back. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the interaction with the people. I enjoyed going down from my mother's apartment to the local bakery and just exchanging a few words with the baker. And it's giving me this huge sort of, freshly made slice of Iranian barberry bread and just eating it on the way home. I mean, these simple pleasures and feelings are, something you feel when you come back to somewhere where you're from.
And what was the art scene like at the time?
So at that time, I didn't even know about the art scene. I mean, there were literally in the early 2000s, maybe 5-6 galleries. Today, there are well over 120, 130. And it's become such a thriving scene that imagine this, Neil. Imagine that today an artist is lucky to have a show that lasts longer than a month because there's such a backlog of artists that want to exhibit and be exhibited that they're just coming through the woodwork. And Friday afternoons has become almost like a weekly event where sort of collectors get together and then just promenade through the streets of Tehran from gallery to gallery, effectively gallery hopping. And it's like a activity that people really look forward to. So I would tell you that the scene is thriving there. There was a group of Iranians who worked for Christie's Dubai, learned exactly how Christie's does a proper auction. And I would tell you that they've set up an auction there called the Tehran auction. The catalogs look and feel like a Christie's catalog. And when you go to the auction room, of course, imagine a sort of very elegant sort of auction setting, but imagine adding an overlay of Persian hospitality where you're sitting down and people in white gloves are serving you little, hors d'oeuvres and aperitifs, while you're in the auction bidding. So it's quite interesting to see how, they've adapted to their own scene. And of course, recognizing that, movement of capital between Iran and outside is very difficult. So they've created their own domestic scene that doesn't need any sort of support from abroad and doesn't need to be, sent abroad either. It's like it's internalized.
A lot of people may be surprised by the idea of a thriving art scene in Iran. one imagines political pressure or censorship. I mean, are those things an issue at all?
I think there are probably red lines you don't want to cross in Iran. And I suppose if you're not a sanctioned political entity, that would be a difficult position for someone to be in. But when it comes to the art scene, I would tell you that largely speaking, the government, have a very hands-off approach. And, I've rarely heard of any meaningful censorship of Iranian art. Of course, there are examples, but very little by way of, true censorship. And, they're very, I would say, at least by not doing anything, they're implicitly supportive of it. And you can actually see that because even when you see Iran's government, showcase themselves at international fairs or exhibitions, I can just tell you what you see if you go to the expo in Dubai, when you go to the Iranian pavilion, 80% of the content is about Iran's culture and history. And so, if you contrast that with other regimes that have an Islamic undertone, there's no promotion of culture. I mean, take the Taliban on the extreme end. They deliberately set about destroying all culture and just carpet bombing anything that has a legacy to Afghanistan's past. The Iranian government, I would say, is not in that camp by any stretch. And as I said, they're happy to promote their culture because it's a win for them as well.
What's the situation with education and training for artists and craftspeople?
So I would say, look, the Iranian government's under pressure financially. And I would say there is not a huge budget for any sort of open support. But of course, there are plenty of art schools in Iran. At university, you can study art history, you can study making of art. And there are thriving schools that are, available for those people who want to pursue that line of career. They're at least doing the minimum to preserve, historical sites. And also, we have this Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. And in the last 10 years, there have been several seminal shows where they've extracted some of those works and showed them on display. I went to this wonderful show in 2013 where, they had brought in Germano Celant, the famous curator who sadly passed away last year from COVID, but he came and did a wonderful show where he got carte blanche to take Farid El-Lashai's works and contrast them with, masters from this sort of incredible Western archive that the Iranian government owned. And it was quite interesting to see all these grandees from the sort of global art scene descend to Tehran for this opening. So I would say they do what they can, but of course they don't have the means of some of their neighbors in the Gulf that are really making huge strides ahead with these very large initiatives, whether it's the Guggenheim or the Louvre or the Qatar Museum of Islamic Art. I mean, they don't have such funding, but I think they've recognized that art, especially a country like Iran that has so much embedded art history, it is a form of soft power, and it's a good use of power because at the end of the day, we live in an age where, unfortunately, across any political society, whether it's in the UK, the US, anywhere, people are divided, but divided in a way where we probably haven't seen such extreme divisions. But when it comes to culture, that's something where people can agree on. Like you and I might not agree on whether you should be a Tory or a Labour supporter, but we can both agree that a piece of art looks good or has some meaning to you and me, right? So I think it's a very interesting way to sort of bridge differences and also lower or soften the tone.
Art can serve as a kind of bridge to the rest of the world.
I think so, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about Iranian art, because I deal with a lot of Americans, I deal with a lot of Europeans, and when I say I'm from Iran, I can see some that are, let's say, less aware about what Iran is. They're like, ooh, it's almost they treat you with a touch of suspicion. Of course, it's momentary, but you can pick it up immediately from the sort of facial or body language. So I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if people saw an alternative narrative to Iran? And really, the greatest asset of Iran is its culture. I mean, forget about oil and what goes on in contemporary Middle Eastern politics today. That's just a fillip in the history of the nation. Every nation has its ups and downs, but Iran's sort of cultural contribution to the world is unquestionable. And I think that anything that promotes that and shows a different light is something I'm for. Because at the end of the day, I'm very grateful to being English, having a passport, and if I were required to fight for love and country, I would fight for England in a heartbeat. But at the same time, I can't deny my ethnic root either. And so it upsets me to see the country portrayed in such a way, because I know the people to be, very different to the way the Western caricature is of that country. And at the same time, I think that if people only knew how much Iran as a country has contributed to things that we use daily, that we sort of recite daily, that we visually enjoy daily, I think it would have a very different, it would change the tone towards Iran.
Listening to you talk about your love of your country and its heritage, it makes me wonder whether you have perhaps a slightly different goal from other people who might collect art.
Look, it's like an onion. There's like multiple layers of why. So for me, I do it because, I think it's important to have another narrative. But I would say at a more granular level, there's a huge artistic scene in Iran that doesn't have, too much financial support from the state, because the state just doesn't have the means. It's a country that's been under sanctions in one form or another for 42 years. And so buying Iranian art helps Iranian artists. That's the best way you can help Iranian artists, is simply to buy their works at a very simplistic level. So if I am able to show great international or great Iranian art to the international world, where there's frankly a ton of money and a ton of interest for new ideas, new works, and they decide to buy Iranian art, then I'm doing my job. And I think that in some way, bringing Iranian art to an international audience has already achieved certain goals. When I started collecting, maybe a handful or two handfuls of Iranian artists globally were represented by major art galleries. Today, there are at least 40, 50 artists that are represented by major international galleries. And those galleries are not selling to Iranian audiences, they're selling to global audiences. So you're seeing these Iranian artists now sit in collections that they couldn't possibly have imagined being in 10, 15 years ago, because there is an interest, there is the talent. And then, of course, over the years, you have to think about how to make this art scene more sustainable, because, tomorrow, I could have this call with you and then cross the street and be run over. And that's the end of my contribution, at least in terms of being active and able to promote. But what will certainly have a more durable or sustainable effect on the Iranian and Middle Eastern art scene are these Middle Eastern and North Africa acquisition committees that have been set up by many prominent museums, including LACMA, Guggenheim, British Museum, Tate, just to name but a few. All these different groups have pulled together people who have an interest in Middle Eastern art and raised funds to buy works that now form part of the permanent collection of each of those respective institutions. And so that is important. And of course, you've seen those works already on display. Like LACMA had a show a couple of years ago where they took a lot of their own works plus invited collectors to lend. British Museum had a wonderful show that ended this past September that was curated by Venetia Porter, who was the head of the Islamic department, called Reflections. And that was entirely based on, the collection that we've amassed that's over 300 works from the British Museum's Middle East and North Africa Acquisition Committee. So, these are important drives because this is what will survive. Even more than, let's say, a multi-billionaire setting up a museum and having a great splash and an opening. No one's thinking about what that museum will look like and feel like in 10, 20 years. Well, I'm pretty certain that the British Museum will be around for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. How do you go about working with artists? Do you just buy things at auction, or do you commission and help artists to develop their work?
It's a bit of everything. I mean, you know, first things first, I think that there is a trajectory that an artist should pursue to, again, manage their own career. I think it's very important for an artist to work with a gallerist who will then work to get the works placed in different collections. And then if the artist is talented enough, start placing those works with museums or start encouraging some sort of museum show or group show participation. So we buy a lot from galleries. We buy a lot from auction. If we see things that are, let's say, very rare or difficult to procure any other way, and they happen to appear in auction, we come in and just try to go for it. We also buy from secondary dealers or families that happen to have, fantastic works in their own archive. And then, there's a generational transition. People know that we're always in the market and they'll call us. We also have artists that do commissions, as you say, when they try an experimental work and let's say they want to make something from a Carrara marble piece and you got to spend money to make it in the fabrication. And you enter into an arrangement where you help fund them and you don't look for a return. You just look for, like, let's say, a decent entry price for that work, so long as they can make more of them. And then other buyers come in. So there are those sort of arrangements as well. So this is how we do it. This is how we source the work and how we help the artists, either directly or through galleries or support them in auction. It depends.
And you mentioned the sanctions, which have been going on for many years. How much of a practical problem, how much of a barrier do they present?
It's a problem because if you're buying works in Iran, you need to have funds in Iran. Now, luckily, I have some funds that are in Iran that I use to pay for my bills there. But sending money into Iran is very difficult because, you just can't transfer money internationally because SWIFT is not accessible for that. It's not an option. So that's why, in a way, there's a sort of bifurcated scene that's developed where people who are in Iran that collect within Iran, they just keep everything in Iran. So they're earning in Iran, they're spending in Iran, they're keeping their works in Iran. Transporting works is not such a problem, although your choice of shippers and your choice of transport is limited. So, there's always a bottleneck because there's a lot of work that wants to go out of Iran, but there's only one or two credible shippers. So logistics is a problem. But, they find a way. I mean, if you need to take money into Iran, there are, these sort of hawala dealers that, they have a brother in Iran, their brother's outside, and you give money to one, he gives you credit another, sort of old school Rothschild banking. And so you can do it. But the reality is that we never had an issue because whilst we sourced a lot of work when we were amassing the collection in the early mid 2000s, financial transfers were not as strict as today. And then the reality is a lot of the work that we source today is out of Iran. So it's not really a practical problem for me, but it is a practical problem for people who are trying to develop a collection in Iran and then bring it out. Because, as I said, transporting the work's not easy and getting money into Iran is not easy.
Tell us about the exhibition, the show that's currently on at the Asia Society, which has this intriguing title, Rebel, Jester, Mystic, Poet. How did the title come about?
I have to give 100% credit to our curator, Dr. Farish Daftari, who is an ex-MoMA curator, highly accomplished in the field, not only recognized in Western circles, but obviously from a great Iranian family and deeply knowledgeable about Iran and the artists that she's picked. And, to her credit, she spent 18 months putting together this collection by trawling through the collection, seeing the works in person, talking to artists. And, when I asked her where the title came, she said it just came to her. She said there were elements of each word that she found to be relevant for this collection. So, this is a show that has 27 artworks, 23 different artists, 9 that are exclusively based in Iran, 9 that are based between Iran and somewhere outside, and 5 that are exclusively based outside of Iran. And each of these words, she's found artworks with these artists that represent rebel. So there's certain works that, let's say, are mildly critical of the system. in Iran. Jester, where there's some that are playful and mocking situations that are, let's say, known to Iranians. Mystic, some works literally have a huge amount of draw or Sufi influence. And poet, this is a sort of homage, if you like, to Iran's rich poetry, but also its tradition of calligraphy. So you have a sampling of each of these works that actually form a very interesting story as you walk around the show. And, you know, as I said, I mean, I've never met somebody that walked out of the show and said, God, I hate that show. That's terrible. Like, it's just got fantastic feedback from every visitor. But I do think, you know, it's important that before you see the show, you try to go online and watch like some of the curated tours and do a little homework, because obviously, you know, each story, each work has a very rich story to it. And, you know, the selection of works that Ferry's put together is fantastic, because on the one hand, she's picked some of the most established Iranian artists like Shirin Neshat, Munir Farmanfarmayan, Parviz Tanavoli, Abbas Kiarostami, the late filmmaker. These are all brand names in the art world. And then on the other hand, she's found artists like Hamid Sahihi, Mortaza Ahmedvand, that don't even, you know, that frankly, literally had no representation, or emerging artists. And she sort of juxtaposed them all together in this wonderful show that really gives you a fantastic snapshot overview of the diversity of Iranian sort of art, because the mediums are diverse. You've got works in the form of an oil drum, you've got neon, you've got carpet, you've got sort of a special plastic sort of cutout. I mean, photo, mirror. I mean, you know, really, it's quite impressive how many different ways you can make art. Ceramic, and so she's also showing you the breadth and the sort of range of some of these artists' work. But interesting to your earlier point in the conversation at the beginning of our call, so many link back to Iran in one way or another. There's always some reference to Iran, and it might be something very political or contemporary, but it might be something as abstract as, you know, Iran's sort of history with Sufism. I mean, it depends what work you're looking at. I know that it's very hard for people to sort of fathom going around museums in the way we did before COVID hit, but this is a wonderfully curated show. It's not a crowded museum. It's like a gem of a museum. And the whole, luckily for us, actually, because there were so many cancellations and movements and people, you know, deferring shows, we ended up taking up the whole museum. So the works actually have more space between them, and it really lends well to a visit. And so I would encourage people to see it if they're in New York, and it's going on until May, as you said, because nothing is better than seeing artwork in person, as you know.
One thing that struck me going around the exhibition was the contrast and variety of the different pieces. I mean, there was a stack of carpets with a kind of jet fighter cut out of them, and then there was the richly decorated oil drum, which also had bullet holes in it. And this kind of theme of war did seem to kind of pervade some of the pieces. But in other places in the exhibition, there was no sense of that. So it's quite a rich mix.
That's right. I mean, like you brought it up brilliantly. I mean, you have some works that clearly characterize Iran in a post-1979 setting, right? If you think about Iran, it's basically been in one form of war or another since the revolution. And you take the work you referenced, Flying Carpet by Farhad Moshiri. These are 32 machine-made carpets, which also there's like multiple meanings here. Like on the one hand, when you think about carpets, you think of Aladdin and the flying carpet. You have this sort of 1001 Arabian Nights notion of a carpet, but also a carpet is a traditional industry in Iran where any weaver could take a year or more to make a single carpet. And of course, that industry is being decimated by the fact that today you have industrial processes that can recreate these carpets albeit machine made. They don't have the same texture or value, but at the same time, if you think about buyers of carpets, 95% of them are just in for the aesthetic. And if they can buy a carpet for $1,000 versus 10,000 that's man-made, they're going to buy the cheaper one. And so there's a subtle criticism of like this sort of carpet industry that's in almost terminal decline because of, you know, the advent of modern technology and industrial processes. But at the same time, there's also a critique of the fact that like here's a society that, you know, used to at one point have, carpet making is a sort of magical, sort of almost cliched feel of being in the souk. And now, you know, the Middle East, Iran, this region has become very militarized. Same thing with the work that you described in the oil drum. You know, this is done by a wonderful female Iranian artist based in California called Shiva Ahmadi. She's taken the old school art of miniature, made this elaborate work across the barrel, but as you said rightly, with violent scenes and bullet holes that have been painted. Because why? She's basically saying that, you know, with the advent of oil, you know, our traditions have been compromised and the society has become, you know, at least from an external perspective, a lot more violent because of, you know, oil and the realities of oil politics. And on the other hand, as you said rightly, that there are other works that you go in the show that have nothing to do with that and are very mystic in nature. You've got YZ Kami's domes, where you look at it and it's almost hallucinogenic. You look at it and you're like, wow, it's like, it's soothing, it's peaceful. Or you look at Shirazeh Hushiari's, you know, pupa, where you see this glass, you know, spiraling structure that is basically the beginning of an infinity column. Reference to her love of Sufism and this notion of infinity and you know, you think of these sort of whirling dervishes going round and round. So you have works that are, and then you have Ali Raza Dayani, where you see the sixth day of creation, where it's the seas, and you see this mad, almost psychedelic work where it's 4 meters or maybe longer, 4.5 meters long by like 1.5 wide or 2 wide, where you see this entire work done in felt tip, you know, point pen of this almost surreal creation of the, you know, the seas. Again, like, what does that got to do with Iran? It's just this guy's sort of view of how the world was created. So it's very random, but it's very diverse and it's very rich. And it shows you that, you know, you can't ghettoize Iranian art in any one bracket.
What's next for you? I understand that you're thinking about setting up a kind of digital museum.
Yeah, so that's something that we're working hard on. It's really over a year in the making. We've had a few false starts because the technology is quite a challenge. But, you know, I've basically assembled a team that's amassed between New York, LA, Tunisia, Iran, Paris, and it includes, you know, some of the top groups in creating video, 3D design. I've got a leading architectural firm of ex-Rem Koolhaas and Herzog de Meuron, architects that have created a structure that could only exist in the virtual world. So we're really trying to put things together that would be clearly influenced from our part of the world. The idea is that it's going to be a virtual archive for anybody to access, free to the public. And, you know, if you want to know about Iranian artworks, you're going to be able to, at least on a website feature, look up any work in the collection, and there'll be a blurb about the artist. You know, obviously it'll be maintained to make sure that all their accomplishments and shows are updated in their biographies. And then there'll be a visual rendering where, you know, we won't bring the entire collection online in one shot. I mean, we'll bring the archive in one shot, but the actual first rendition of this virtual museum will be focused on the architectural sort of story, and also a new selection of works. There'll probably be sort of 30 to 40 works with a possibility of seeing the rest of the works, albeit at a distance. And I know it sounds a little vague, but I don't want to be too specific because it's still not yet finished, and I want to leave an element of surprise. But the idea is that it's going to be a new way to look at art. It's going to be taking these artworks and doing things you could never do in a world with gravity. I'll say that. So that way you can understand that we're going to play with the fact that we're going to have works suspended. And And I think it's going to be a nice way for people to see the work because, it seems to me that these pandemics are going to become a new reality of life as we have variants and what have you. And also, sadly, not everyone has the opportunity to see some of these works in person. So it's great to at least have some way to deliver these works, at least in an online setting, while continuing to, try to do a work or show every year or two in a new location and keep this sort of roadshow going. That's my idea. So it's a combination of bricks and clicks, if you like.
Is the goal to also make it easier for audiences in Iran to see some of the works in your collection?
Absolutely. So on the technology, I've made it very clear that it has to be available in a way where, understanding the bandwidth and the cable restrictions and broadband restrictions you have in Iran. I don't mean by way of filter. I mean, just the speed of their network is a lot slower than what you would find, let's say, in Korea, where it's the fastest. It can't be a show that only Koreans can access. It's got to be accessible at different levels to people who have different speed access to the internet. So the answer is absolutely. This is as much for people in Iran as it is for people outside.
What would be your advice to others who might want to do the same sort of thing, for countries where they may not be perhaps known as widely on the international scene for art as they would like? How would you suggest that people follow your example?
Yeah, I would say, look, every way you can promote art counts. I mean, I'm lucky that I've sort of stumbled into a network of people who've made ideas happen. I happen to know people in the museum community, and I'm friends with a lot of gallerists and dealers, and they've all been supportive because I think they've recognized that there's really nothing to gain here other than increase Iran's sort of art exposure. So people are always happy to help. And I think if you can cultivate your own network and promote things, in any capacity, it's worth it. And today the possibilities are endless because, when I started doing this, the world of, let's say, online social media was not the force it is today. And as you can see, people can be from nowhere and build an incredible online presence. And so that could easily be translated for art too. And you don't have to have money to do that. You just have to be clever. And so I would be very supportive of it. I would tell them, don't be shy to ask favors. Don't be shy to send proposals, because the worst thing someone can say is no. They're not going to say, no, drop dead, I wish you never contacted me. It's just going to be a no. Sorry, I can't help. But you'd be surprised. People are looking for new ideas. And there's so much art in the world. It's funny. I think about some seminal moments when they opened up the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. The whole idea was about tolerance. And interestingly, the way the museum show starts, it has works from, I guess, I can't remember, but maybe 1000, 2000 BC, but from different parts of the world, showing this notion of, mother and child. But these are three cultures that never could have, given what we know, had never, ever had any overlap. But yet the works were being developed in parallel. And so I think in this age that we're in now, anything that promotes misunderstood or unknown cultures is a plus, right? I mean, this is a generation that is constantly feeding on new and novel, and their attention span getting smaller. And so I would be very supportive, and I would tell people, try, do it, and don't be shy to ask, because as much as you think that they're doing you a favor, you're also doing them a favor, because the job of these museums and these galleries is to bring new content. And so think of yourself as like a venture capitalist introducing them to a new opportunity. Whether they take it or not, it depends on who you're dealing with and what's a priority for them. But never be afraid to push your own art cause or your own, culture forward, because there's going to be somebody who's interested. That's all I'll say.
Mohammed Afkhami, thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil, and pleasure to meet you. And please, when lockdown settle, it would be great to catch up over a meal in London or wherever our paths cross.
Thank you very much for being with us for this episode of the ideaXme Show. ideaXme is a global platform. Our mission is to move the human story forward by sharing knowledge of the future. You can find us on all major audio networks at www.radioideame.com, on YouTube and Vimeo. Please subscribe.